Please be seated. So years ago, there's a social scientist, her name is Brene Brown, and she repopularized a speech given by Teddy Roosevelt years ago entitled The Man in the Arena. And the book she wrote, Brene Brown, was entitled Daring Greatly. In the beginning of the speech by Teddy Roosevelt, he makes this observation that it's not the critic who counts, it's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man in the arena whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. I don't know about you, but there's some days when I feel like I'm entering into an arena. And in that space of entering into an arena where you're having to kind of fend for your life and find your way forward, there are some ways in which you and I have to kind of quiet the noise of critics and kind of say to ourselves, if you're not in this arena getting your tail kicked, I really don't care about your advice or your observations or your reviews. And so as we think about what it means for you and I to wrestle, we all wrestle with how do we make choices and how we're going to be and how we're going to show up and how we're going to be encouraged on any given day. And for me, and maybe like you, you're looking for those inspirations of how you can be inspired to be in your designated arena. So this past week, in a week I call for me the week that was, my grandson, Colton, became my inspiration. And here's a picture of Colton. He has suited up for wrestling. So at age 5, he's wrestling, and which again, when I was growing up, you weren't wrestling suited up in this kind of way as an extracurricular activity. And he's got not exactly a menacing look, not exactly ready for WWE main event, but he reminds me, and hopefully reminds you, that you and I sometimes have to suit up for life to kind of find our way forward in whatever we wrestle with. In the Bible, this story of this character named Jacob. And Jacob was one of these persons. He was a con artist that got conned. He was a liar that got lied to. He was a manipulator that got manipulated. And there's a story in the Bible where he's in a wilderness and he's wrestling with a stranger throughout the night. And Jacob discerns that this being that he's wrestling with that injures his hip is a supernatural presence. And he wrestles this being until this being blesses him. And so this being, this person that wrestled with Jacob, gave Jacob a new name, Israel, which means he struggles with God. And what's so powerful to me about this struggle that Jacob had was this moment in which he just realized there was this great God that just wanted to bless his life. And this was his experience of being in this arena, drawing out some sense that God was with us. So today's scripture lesson ties to a moment in Jesus' life on the heels of a wrestling match that Jesus had with Satan in the wilderness. In Luke chapter 4, there's this story about Jesus receiving his blessing, if you will, and a lens he would have to kind of carry forward in order to manage and journey through life. So for all of us that sense like we are in arenas and we have to wrestle with life and choices and the voices of critics and the voices of supporters, for any of us to have this sense that we have to have the clarity of how do we journey forward from lessons of hard times. There's a word from this scripture lesson for how Jesus imagined moving forward. So connect with me here in Luke chapter 4. After Jesus had this wrestling match with Satan, which, by the way, he prevailed, Jesus emerges with this statement. As he enters into a place of worship at a synagogue, he declares these words as he assumes that space of teaching as a rabbi. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has appointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then Jesus just stops, right? Like this moment in which he's just like landed a sermon, and he just rolls up the scroll, gave it back to the synagogue assistant, and sat down. And every eye in the synagogue was fixed on him, and he began to explain to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled just as you heard it." Now, if this were a wrestling match, this moment, this scripture, this sermon by Jesus was a body slam. It was 17 seconds, if you were to time this, 17 seconds that Jesus reads from Isaiah as his sermon, and it is one of the most celebrated, most impactful sermons that we're still quoting today. 17-second sermon that changed the universe and the world. And what's so powerful for us as we look at this scripture is we see that Jesus begins by saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. I have been appointed and anointed. God is sending me. And it's clear, as Jesus is highlighting me, there's a connecting point for you as how you have a lens on this world. If you're looking for meaning, whenever we look at this word meaning, it always begins forever and always with two letters, M-E, me. Jesus in this moment is teasing out what his ambition will be. In a world where there were so many expectations on a Messiah, Jesus understood what his calling was, what that meant to him. So Jesus was able to say, "Here's my lane. I am called to these areas of reaching people that are oppressed, to marginalized people. I will focus my attention there because that's where I will find meaning for the call that God has on my life." Notice Jesus doesn't say, "I'm here for the salvation of the world." He doesn't say, "I am dying for someone's sins." No, he looks in a direction and he points his energy and his heart and his journey to accepting, "God, what is your call on my life?" And he gives it a focus. If you've been with us throughout this year, we've been highlighting a book called The Book of Joy, written by Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. And we've been highlighting this book because we want to kind of give you some directional steps on how to manage having clarity on your life and your calling as you journey forward. And in this book, what I was fascinated to read this week, as I think about how you and I are in these wrestling matches with ourselves and our souls and our journeys and our spirits, getting clarity and gaining clarity in our lives. In this particular chapter this week, it talked about how do you find hope in hard times? How do you have clarity on finding meaning for your life? We all can have plans, and we can all have ways that we imagine who we want to show up and be. But the Bible teaches us, and we have found this to be true as followers of Jesus, is we discover meaning when the Lord's plans prevail in our lives. And so Desmond Tutu, he has this quote where he talks about that contrast in life between the good times and the bad times. With this quote on the screen, he says this: "We don't really get close to others if our relationship is made up of unending hunky-doriness. It is the hard times and the painful times, the sadness and the grief that knits us more closely together." One of the emotions that you and I feel during hard times is an emotion called sadness. And what sadness teaches us and can teach us, is, according to some studies, is it gives us some lessons on understanding our capacity and finding meaning in our life. Studies demonstrate that sadness will last much longer than fear. One study says that fear will last about 24 hours, that kind of deep, resonant way that you and I can just feel that emotion of fear, on average will last 24 hours. And of course, we can recall that moment later, but it can last about 24 hours. With sadness can last up to 5 days. And when you and I are feeling sadness, it's one of those moments we can gain clarity on the meaning of our lives. What will sadness teach me? What we've learned about sadness is when we're feeling sad, we actually have better judgment. When we're feeling sadness, we can have different ways of recalling memory. And it turns out, even when we're experiencing sadness, we can become more generous than when we are during happier times. So as I'm thinking about becoming more generous as we experience sadness, I just caught the eye of our financial chairperson for Trinity, and I'm thinking, to solve this budget problem, brother, I need to make the congregation more sad. But seriously, for you and I, as we think about sadness, how does that emotion bring forth clarity about our meaning? This past week, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is a pastor and a principal. He's bivocational. And when he was telling me his story of how he's trying to protect his students in the wake of potentially mass deportations and the vulnerable populations at his school, and what it means to create a safe place for his students and their families, how to create protocols so in case there is an ICE raid, how the letter of the law is kept, but yet these vulnerable populations aren't unnecessarily harmed. And as he's talking about his world and he's trying to bring his faith into his workplace of being a principal and also being a pastor, I just felt sadness for him. I felt sadness for our country. I felt sadness for families. Because what my pastor principal friend did not know was days before, within an hour of President Trump being inaugurated, the Denver Post reached out to me for a statement. They asked the question, how would your congregation respond to children being separated from their families if deportation happened? In my statement to them, I don't know if it'll be ever published at all, but my statement was, I consider separation of children from their families to be inhumane. And my congregation would consider separation of children from their families as an outrageous action. I may have gone out on a limb assuming or thinking that that would be your reaction. But I do know this, if you can just look at this picture of a family and think about your own connection with your mother or father, and allow Jesus to preach this 17-second sermon that he preached in the Gospel of Luke to you. And you think about the complication that you may have with a mom or a dad or a person who's cared for you. And if there was this forced way that you're separated, again, policy aside, but just the emotion of being separated from people that are destined, assigned to care for you as a child. Does it make you sad? Without having to fix or think or be political about policy or position, just as a human being, what does sadness evoke for you? To do what Jesus did. Because churches all across America are saying, oh, what would Jesus do? No, what Jesus did. Jesus looked, focused his attention on marginalized people. Jesus reversed the tendency to just kind of care for ourselves and our walk with God and focus our eyes on loving like Jesus did the oppressed, the poor, women. He chose to find meaning, and he realized meaning began with those two letters, M-E, me. I want to invite AJ and Jerome to share a song with you. And as they're sharing this song, I want you to allow these lyrics to kind of speak to your heart as maybe a way that you take responsibility for God's call in your life in this season. As you think about what it means to find meaning with the choices that you make, meaning with how you commune with your neighbors, meaning with how you embrace your family. Just accept the words of this song as an invitation to find meaning. And what does it mean for you in this season of the world to ask this question and allow the lyrics of the song to answer for you in this season of change? Where does God want you to be?